Welcome, everyone. I'm ZSun-nee Miller Matema, and today we're going to have Margo Lee Williams, who has written three books. We're going to discuss them, especially her last book, Born Missionary. And Tolson's Chapel is really interested in preserving the legacy of not only churches, but people who are interested in writing about them. And we hope that you will be interested as well in helping us to preserve our history if you are. And if you would like to contribute, we would love for you to go to our website. That would be tolsonschapel.org. So if you would like to do that, we would appreciate it. So now, as you can see, this beautiful woman sitting beside me, this is Margo Lee Williams. And more importantly than anything that she's written is that she has been in my life, friends for, I'm afraid to say, but 30 years. You said it. We were hoping just to imagine, but not to say, but it's okay. And the whole time that we've been friends, she has always been interested in history, preserving it, and writing about it. And to her credit, she has three books: Miles Lassiter, Circa 1777 to 1850. It says here, an early African-American Quaker, which a lot of people don't know anything about, from Lassiter Mill, Randolph County, North Carolina. Her second book, this is a book, folks. This is a book, a big one, From Hilltown to Strieby. This is Strieby. We always say Strieby, but it's Strieby. Strieby, okay? And this one is about the education and the American Missionary Association in, now you're going to have to tell me, Uwharrie. Okay, Uwharrie backcountry of Randolph County, North Carolina. And of course, her new book, Born Missionary. The Isley Walden story. And that's an interesting first name, too. Is Isley?
Isley, it's Scottish.
Okay, so
it's actually an island.
An island. Oh, is this from, when you said island, what do you mean by that?
Because Scotland has many outer islands.
Oh, I'm thinking about something a little different, but it's okay. I'm going all the way back to the British Isles, and I'm thinking, what if anything did Scotland have to do to contribute in generations to him?
No, it's just the name comes from that island, and it's a popular Scottish name, and the area, Randolph County has a lot of Scots, Irish, who settled there.
Well, first of all, tell me, what about Mr. Walden and his story impressed you to the point where you're going to write a book about it? And I guarantee you that outside of North Carolina, people do not know who he is. So
actually, that's not true.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Because Isley Walden is a noted 19th century African American poet.
Oh.
And so what is different about my book is that I'm not focused on him as the poet.
Mm-hmm.
I am focused on him as the missionary who came and founded Strieby Church. He was from the community. He had been enslaved in the community. When he was freed, he walked to Washington, D.C., not right away, but a couple of years later, 1867. He walked to Washington, D.C., and was eventually able to, I'm shortening the story quite a bit here.
But could you stop just one minute? He walked to Washington, D.C. from?
Randolph County, North Carolina.
Okay, now continue.
Which is just south of Greensboro.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's what we all say when we think about it. You walked, huh? It's a lot of determination in people, and I'm sure there are stories like that of people who have walked great distances because there really were no options for them in that time period, and they walked. That's what they did. They walked. Mm-hmm. So he walked to Washington, D.C. It's not like he walked it overnight. I mean, it's a journey. And in fact, he stopped in Raleigh, where he got married briefly, and apparently it didn't last. She did not continue the trip with him, and he never mentioned her again.
You know, that sounds familiar.
Yes.
But it's okay.
And I did find I know who she married afterwards.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, how did they meet? Just incidental to everything, but how did they meet?
I don't know exactly, but she seemed to be living in the same community where his cousins were, And so I assume that he met her through that, in that community, when he was staying there before he continued on to Washington.
Okay, so now,
Anyway, so he's in Washington, and actually he leaves Washington and goes to New Jersey, meets members, a minister and some other members of the Reformed Church in New Jersey, and people at Rutgers, what is then Rutgers College. They managed to get him a scholarship to return to Washington and attend Howard University. And he does. He enrolls first he gets some tutoring, and then he's up to par to be able to enter the normal school program, which is the teaching program at Howard, and to raise money because he was very rhyme was very easy for him, and so he was constantly rhyming, and so he wrote a volume of poems, a small volume of poems, and he published them, and he used that to raise money for his own personal money use.
may I ask, I recall that you wrote that he had lost vision, or
he was born partially blind. I'm pretty sure he had congenital cataracts, because he made a comment at one point about when people look at his eyes. And when you have congenital cataracts, you can see the cataracts. They were not so bad that he couldn't see shadows and shapes and so forth. So he wasn't what you would call completely blind, but he's what we would call legally blind. So he certainly needed assistance, but he could get around.
But so how did that impede? One would think it would impede his writing of poetry, etc., but it didn't appear to.
Good question. I'm not really clear on that. He doesn't write about it, and it's very hard to find other people who have written about him. People have written quite a bit about his poetry, but they haven't written about him, which is part of what spurred me to write about him. I do know that he hired readers. He sort of always had, and that was another reason he needed extra money. And he talks about that later on, that he had to hire people to help him as note takers and people who could write letters for him and so forth. So he always had some assistance.
And he may have dictated, and then which is really wonderful. Just, I'm telling you, as one gets just a little bit older, one realizes the necessity
to have eye problems.
Yes, and then we understand how valuable those assistants can be.
Yes. So he graduates from Howard in 1876, and he continues back up to New Jersey, and because at this point he knew he wanted to be a minister as well. And so he was able to get another scholarship to attend the New Brunswick Theological Seminary.
Okay.
And he, at that point, again, to raise extra money for himself, he wrote another small volume of poems called Sacred Poems. Most of them seem to be focused on the Psalms. Some are prayers, and reflections on his view of God, kind of, or his relationship with God, I should say.
May I ask what you think was the value? I mean, we can guess, but I'm wondering if you look behind the scenes in any way to ask yourself, what was the value of African Americans in early America going towards the church, making everything a sacred vow towards the church? I mean, there's an obvious answer, but I don't accept that exactly. There's something else. What do you think was behind his, not just him, but here we are in Tolson's chapter, same thing here. What was that? Was that a way? Well, I'm not going to say, let you say first.
Spirituality is a part of the human condition. There are no humans anywhere on the planet who don't have a spiritual system of some sort. Certainly by the time one has come out of enslavement, the only formalized spiritual path there's always your internal spiritual journey. And he certainly was on his own internal, personal, spiritual journey. But in terms of formalized religion, Christianity was what was known. Since then, we've expanded and learned other paths and recaptured paths that we knew about, that we knew our people knew historically. But at that time, really the only thing available in terms of a formal religious path was Christianity. And he, but education, I mean, those were two things that were of great importance to him. While he was at Howard, he started what was known as a Sabbath school. And I don't know.
Was that like a Sunday school for adults?
It's for children and adults.
Oh, okay.
And it's, the focus is the Sabbath schools were actually established on the Sabbath because people had to work other days. And so on Sunday, they were calling Sunday the Sabbath. And so on Sundays, they were able to be free to come. They had free time. Even under the worst of circumstances, people had Sundays off. And so, or to a large extent, had it off. And so they were able to come on Sundays to learn to read and write. And so these were actually just what they called then common schools, one-room schoolhouses, and that for exactly like this, that were often in churches. This one was not. It was actually at the Washington Law School in D.C. And it was very popular. But he was always forward-thinking. He had a music program. He fostered. Of course, some of that comes from his training at Howard. I mean, and Howard in many ways is, it's not officially a religious school, but it has a divinity school now. It has a strong, it has always had a strong presence of faith and religion. So he had sewing classes. The students learned to sew, they learned to sing. So there was, the reading and the writing and the math and everything from the time. It apparently was very successful because the Washington Bee, which was a black newspaper that published in Washington for many years, as late as 1892, was referencing him in the school. He was already dead almost 10 years, but they were still referencing his time in Washington with his Sabbath school.
I'm going to look for that. Because I think, that there just might be an opportunity for me to read more about him in some of those old newspapers. So
then in New Jersey, there is definitely, I have not found that much in Washington, a couple of things, but not that much in Washington. By the time he gets to New Jersey in the seminary, he starts another school there called the Students' Mission. And he had over 60 students in that school. He had a kind of Alcoholics Anonymous program and a temperance program going. And he used the children to teach the parents how to get away from that. He had from alcoholism. He had a very successful education program, sewing, music.
it really was so diversified.
He was very diverse.
And
very diverse. They were bursting at the seams. He took all his scholarship money. In fact, he writes this letter to the dean the year before he's to graduate because he's in deep debt to the school. Because instead of using his scholarship money to pay for his tuition and so forth, he took his scholarship money and invested in the Students' Mission. And he tells them, I'm getting ready to graduate, and you really should be taking this over. The school is bursting at the seams. We need more space. I can't do it. I need more money so that I can graduate, pay off my debts, hire my assistant for the year, and graduate.
You mentioned the temperance program, and I recall some years ago reading about the evangelical program of many tent ministers who would show up all over the country, especially in the South. And I'm just, I'm wondering about that because I understand that that was a big draw. And then there was something about the temperance programs, and I'm wondering, had he ever, to your knowledge, ever been invited to or attended one of these tent evangelical meetings? Do you know about that? I'm just because there was a connection there.
No, he actually, the big proponent of temperance at the time, at his time, and that he sort of converged with in Washington was a Senator Pomeroy. And Senator Pomeroy had a huge convention in Washington for the temperance movement. And I believe he was in attendance there. And he was very enamored of Senator Pomeroy and wrote a poem in honor of him. He was actually one of the other reasons I think people are not have not done a lot of research on him, frankly, is he's been very mainstream in his lifestyle. And so I think that has not won in certain circles, it has not won him favor.
And especially in today's circle, right?
And what we call the progressive movement.
Yes.
He would not be a fan. On the other hand, he was incredibly successful. So he heads back to Washington. He stops in Goldsboro, North Carolina, which is a large town in eastern North Carolina. Crossroads of the railroads at that time. They had a huge African American population. In fact, it had the only African American mental sanitarium in North Carolina. And they beg him to stay there and start a high school. But he does not. He goes back to our county, rural North Carolina, and starts the church and the school there, and grew the community in such a way that they were able to get their own post office. In fact, the community was originally known, and that's why the title of the second book is Hilltown. The community was known as Hilltown. 4 years after he turns, or not even 4 years after he turns, the community has grown enough that he's able to petition the government for a post office, and he requests that it be called Strieby after one of the principal members of the American Missionary Association.
It just seems to me that a lot of people, and I haven't done an intense amount of research, but just in looking at my own family, it seems that what you're saying about being mainstream sometimes is characteristic of a lot of those early ministers. And that's why I ask you about why do you think African Americans were so engaged with the Christian religion, and other than, I know it took them oratorical skills. In many cases, they learned by being ministers, speaking, before the conference.
But it was and it still is a very African style of Christianity. It is not. It's not mainstream in the sense that we think of white churches. And so it has its own. They brought their own
brand,
their own historical memory. They didn't remember necessarily the specific tribal religions or Islam if they came from an Islamic community. They adapted the Christianity because several generations down the road, well, that's what's around me, so Christianity. But it had its own very distinctive style of Christianity, and it still does.
And it does because in terms of how they, the singing,
the call and response, and you say the oratory, the celebration, the celebration.
I think you're right.
It has its own style of spirituality, and as I said, all people are spiritual, so they find a way.
That's right.
They find and then they make their own.
Was he ever a Mason? Did he have any?
I tried to find out that, and there's no evidence that he was ever a Mason.
Because,
and he never mentions anything to indicate that he was interested in being a Mason.
Okay, because it just, that seemed to follow with.
I thought so too. I thought so too. I thought so too.
Well, there were other orders of different types of organizations.
investigated. I know you know James Morgan, and
Yes.
we, your listeners know, viewers know, James is an historian specifically with Masons, but he does know a lot about many of the other orders, and he did help me look. There's no evidence. There's no evidence.
So he was quite independent.
He was quite independent.
He was quite independent. A true thinker and an entrepreneur with many a philosophy that embraced a lot of different avenues. Yes. You know, I think, you know, it's so hard to for people in today's world to understand that. Really, I found that out, that it's very difficult for us now to accept some of the things that happened, or the ways in which some of the early leaders of our communities operated. And you said it yourself, that they were thought to be mainstream. And today, those that consider themselves mainstream, they very well be, you know, conservatives, I guess you would think, right? That's what I would think. So, okay, so he does all of these things, and he graduates from Howard. He starts Sabbath school. He started that before he left Howard. And then he moves on. His poetry, how does his poetry spread?
I gather it became fairly popular because one of the things I do find is announcements for the sale of his poetry, that, you know, Mr. Isaac Walden has these poems available, this book, you know, you could buy it. In newspapers all over the country, I find it in advertisements in Brooklyn, in Kentucky, in Pittsburgh, in Minnesota, in remote areas, in the Red Wing, Minnesota. I don't even know where Red. I'm sorry, I'm not. It's just I don't know where it is, and I'm baffled as to how they heard about it. I would understand Chicago and New York, and I see that, but then I see these other very small communities in places where I wouldn't expect to have, you know, in Colorado, in Denver.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
So his work did spread.
It began to spread. Yeah.
Did it spread by way of the African Americans who were following him, or whites who were following him? Okay. All right. So now he has his poetry, he's selling his books, and he's moving on. What next captured your attention? Because when you write, because, like, you know, as you've told me so often, how would I know? Because I'm not following your good advice, which is to write books, right?
So you'll get there.
Maybe. Oh, I better hurry up. But anyway, what captured your attention? You can't write about everything, but you
can.
So, because that's why you have, as you've said, so many boxes of information, because you gather it, but then when you look at it, you think, well, look, I've got a book to write. What has impressed me, or what is it that I'm taking away with what this man achieved in his life? You know?
What I was particularly struck by, probably one of the things that I found a lot of information when I was writing the second book, and there is quite a bit on him in there, but it does focus more on him, although it tells about his journey. It sees him more as the poet turned missionary. I realized as I began to do more work, more research on him, and I began to see he didn't actually care about poetry. The poetry was a vehicle to him. It was something he could do. It was easy for him. Mm-hmm. It was something he could do. It was kind of, I don't know, we all have little things that just kind of do.
Or was it the YouTube type of its day? I mean, how else do you get information?
He knew he could make money, that people were willing to pay him to. He had done hard labor. He worked we have gold mines. We did have gold mines in our area in Randolph County. He'd worked in the gold mines. He'd worked in the fields. He was done with that. He wanted, and he knew that people were willing to pay him for his poetry. Once he discovered that, he's like, okay, I don't need to do that anymore. I'll do this. But he didn't care about that. It was a vehicle. Even his first book of poems is called Miscellaneous Poems, which the author dedicates to the cause of education and humanity. That's what he was focused on. And when you really read through the poems and really focus on it, which I dare say the English departments, although they reprint some of his poems, they talk about him in the anthologies and so on, they haven't figured this out yet. He doesn't care about the poetry. He cares about relationship with God, your interior spiritual, and your relationship with your neighbor. He's dare I say, and you'll have to excuse me, I'm a religious educator. He says, love God, love your neighbor. That's where he's focused. Love God, love your neighbor. That's what he's doing with his life. The poetry was how he got there.
Okay.
Once he got there, he never wrote another poem.
Well, that's very good. I mean, he communicated it, and that was it. So, okay. But what happened thereafter? Here he is now. His poetry's out, but now he's found an avenue so that he can.
He's come back. He's developed his church and the school. In fact, he developed 2 churches and schools.
Yes, I saw that. 2 churches.
That's right.
And 2.
And 2
that's
schools.
A lot
he found
to do.
Both of those. He married a woman that he had met in New Jersey. She came back. She brought her sister back. Married another member of my family, because he's not a direct relative of mine. And they were teachers at the school.
His wife and sister.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And he, unfortunately, got sick. He wasn't there 4 years when he got sick and died.
Because he was 42, wasn't he? 40. That's very young.
Very young.
I mean, even
very
then,
young.
that was young. I mean,
Yes.
But just imagine, also when we were little girls, women and men, people in general who were like 50 were like old. Now, they're just.
It looks very different from here, doesn't it?
Yes. They're just mere children. But back then, it was really old. So maybe 40 wasn't too bad. But
well, they say he died of acute bronchitis. Whenever usually that means you have some pneumonia going on. So it's more, and I've said it. It's more likely he died of pneumonia. So he had the church, the schools. He convinced the legislature in North Carolina that no one should be drinking or selling any alcohol within 6 miles of his school.
Really?
Yes.
Did he have that kind of power?
Apparently, because I've seen it in the laws that you are not to drink within 6 miles of Promised Land Academy.
And what a beautiful Promised Land Academy.
Yes.
Yes,
but then they changed everything to Strieby, including the church and the school.
So this is his story. Mm-hmm. What I'm also interested in, your story.
Well, this is my maternal family's community.
Okay.
All 3 books are basically about my maternal family. Miles Lassiter, who mentioned earlier, the Quaker, he was the only African American Quaker in North Carolina when he died in 1850, and there was not another until after the Civil War.
And most people do not know that history.
That's right.
At all. Who ever heard of a Black Quaker? But they did exist.
Yes, they did.
Well, yes.
And so he's my 4th great-grandfather.
Miles.
Yes. And then fast forward then to the 1860s. As I said, Isley Walden is from the community. He's not a direct relative of mine. His family married cousins of, Bill Waldens and Lassiters who married each other, and then the community was called Hilltown because there were a large number of Hill family members there also. So all these families had all intermarried and so forth. So as I say, he's not a direct ancestor of mine, but we're all cousins of cousins of cousins of cousins. And we belong to the small community.
And how does what you?
So this is my family.
Yes,
so this is my family church. Then this is the church that my maternal family grew up in and was a part of.
But now, how does this journey, especially Miles, of course, but You said it's
Isley.
Isley. How does that mirror your life, perhaps? Is there any place where it comes together, conjunct somewhere? What, because I only say that because as a writer, though, okay, of course, I've never written the big book, but as a writer, you do tend to find, like therapists, I've heard this from therapists, that they say that the clients that come to them are meant not, yes, you do have to work with them to help them heal, but they've also come for you, I should say, because exactly what you are exhibiting or what you're hiding, they are exposing by coming to you for that exact same, thing. So writers, I think, during the time I did that, I found out that was true. But I'm wondering, as a writer, do you tend to find some kinship with some aspect of the people who you're writing about?
For sure. So the first up, because my earliest research, things kind of went in order. So my earliest research was on Miles, and it was amusing to me because I went to my elementary school. I grew up in New York City, but in Queens. For your viewing audience, I would say what you would know is now known as City Field. So I grew up near the World's Fair grounds, what's now where the Mets play, where the U.S. Open is played. That's my home area. So, in an area called Flushing, which was a Quaker community. And so I grew up literally 2 blocks from the Bound House, which is an early historic Quaker site. And my school was called Foxwood School, and it was intentionally named for George Fox, the founder of the Society of Friends, which is the official name for.
I read some of his books. I was thinking he did write books, didn't he? But I thought it was the kind of books that he read on using the mind, seeing God through the spiritual. And maybe I'm wrong now. The spiritual aspect of the gift we have been given, which is the mind. Yes.
That we're all able to discern God's through, and that's why in Quaker meeting things are quiet so that you can hear God speak to you.
And it's beautiful.
Right.
It's beautiful.
So I thought it was amusing that here I've been brought up around Quaker, the sort of Quaker philosophy. It was not a religious school, it was a secular school, but a guiding principle for the headmistress. It was a private school. The guiding principle for the headmistress was Quaker, the Quaker values.
Were the teachers Quakers?
No.
Oh, okay.
They came from all walks. Everything was from all walks, but it was, as the headmistress, this was her guiding principle.
So there you are, as a young person, not really knowing, but still finding yourself in my favorite word, in the middle view of the Fox philosophy, even though it wasn't given to you in school.
That was in my genetic memory.
That's right.
That's
it.
Yeah. So I thought, I had a great chuckle on it when I just, I was like, oh, that's perfect.
And you connect, don't you know? I'm finding that's so true.
Yes.
You connect with people. You think that you're just meeting them as strangers, but what is the saying? You never meet a stranger?
Yes.
Because we never do.
Yeah.
And, I'm sitting here beside you, across your feet, and Margo, all I can say is, I'm so proud of everything that you've done. And I know, I don't want to get emotional, but I love you. And I'm just, just looking at your work and look at this. This is a lot of work, that people have done here, that she's done. And it took a lot of time, hours of quietude, which is probably one of the things I'm against. Is the quietude of being focused and disciplined to do this. And I'm really so proud of you for it.
People talk about being disciplined. I suppose discipline. I suppose there's a sense of discipline. Really, to me, it was more about being driven. I wanted those stories told. I was determined they weren't going to be lost. Mm-hmm. It was, and so
Passion that drew you on.
It was the passion really that made me find time, made me make time, made me prop the eyelids up or whatever. More so because I attend, sort of, or participate in various writing webinars and seminars and so on. And they talk about this just, well, you need to set aside this time of day, and that's your writing time of day, and you need to do this, and your desk should, make your desk this, and make your room that. And I'm like, hey, give me the computer, give me a spot where I can land. I push everything aside, just enough space for my body to fit. I've got a plug next to me, the plug in the thing, and I turn it on, and we're off. And that's it. I'm like, well, what's with the needing to be?
Well, passion will drive you to an end, hopefully an end that you are proud of. Because,
Well,
for sure. So this, of course, has been very positive, and you've allowed the world, and you've been rewarded and awarded, right?
I have.
You have.
Fortunately.
Yes,
Very fortunately.
Tell us about the awards that you've received so far.
Okay, so for the first book, the fun story on that one was I had nothing to do with how it happened. I got a phone call one afternoon sitting at my desk at work, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, phone rings, and I answer the phone, and this person says, "Congratulations, you, I'm so-and-so, and I'm calling, congratulations. You've been awarded the North Carolina Genealogical Society's book of the year for publishing a family history." And I'm like, "Excuse me? Who is this? And is this a joke? I mean, like, who are you?" And she said, "No." She said, "Didn't you know anything about it?" I said, "No." She said, "You didn't put your book forward?" I said, "No."
So someone is watching with a very positive eye and a good ear.
Exactly. The only thing we ever figured out was that I had forwarded it to the society to ask them to advertise it in their newsletter and potentially to review it. And they figure someone in that loop passed it on to the awards committee.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first award for that.
You're accomplished, as they say. So I'll get there one day, Margo. But you're accomplished. Okay.
Having learned that lesson, though, I learned that it was a good thing to find out about and pursue those award programs.
That's right.
That you might be fitted for. And so with the second book, I was much more proactive.
Good.
And I've managed to garner 8 awards for that book.
How many? 8? Yes. Oh, Margo.
And they're not all first place awards, and that's okay.
And that is okay.
But they have
acknowledgement. Yes.
Exactly.
So, well, was there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers here at Tolson's Chapel? This is our Right Talk program.
Right.
And we would, if anything you'd like to share with them that you may not have said, maybe it did or did not come through the books, but you've been thinking about it since, which often happens, I'm sure. You write a book and you say, "Oh, I should have put that in." Anything like that?
Nothing that I can think of offhand. I mean, there's always the temptation to dump it all in.
Yes.
And with the second book, I have to say I've done a little more of that. I put not only history in, but I put 4-generation genealogies in of each of the families, main families, the Hills and the Lassiters, who are buried in the cemetery. There's a listing of everyone in the cemetery. There's a listing of all the names of people I discovered through death certificates who were buried there but have no headstones, so you wouldn't know. So I've been joking with the family. I said, all that land your kids have been running around on, they think it's just open land. Those are people under there.
And I always had that feeling when I'm at the cemetery. I've seen some people just step right on top of the graves, especially Arlington and other cemeteries where tourists are coming. And I keep trying to say, excuse me, I said, just with respect. I mean, you just stepped right, all of you just walked right on it. Can't you go around? So I guess that's something that, again, is a spiritual thing that comes from some people that others may not have.
May not feel.
They may not feel.
But so, I will tell you perhaps the most interesting thing that has happened lately is that we did apply for and were awarded what's known as a literary landmark marker for Isley Walden to be located at the church.
That is wonderful.
And literary markers are not well known. And we're only the second one in North Carolina. And it's not because there aren't other literary figures in North Carolina. There are dozens of them. Mm-hmm. But people don't know about the marker program.
I'm glad you mentioned
and
that.
So I think it's important to make note. And so this is we're very excited. We're just now working up when the unveiling date is going to be and so on and so forth. So
thank you for lighting the way for that, because there are writers who deserve it. Because the books are written about them, then at their, at the churches where they may be ministers or whatever.
Or it doesn't have to be a church. There's no home place there's no other place to mark for him. And since he is buried at the church and he founded the church and the school, that is the place. But for some of the literary markers, they are the homes where the people were born. Or how I found out about literary markers was one for Langston Hughes in New York at our community Langston Hughes library. They were able to get a marker for him at our library. Yeah. So there are libraries that are marked, homes that are marked, cemeteries that are marked, churches that are marked, schools that are marked. There are all sorts of places that are marked.
Thank you for that information.
I mean, you have to justify why you've chosen that spot, but they have there's no limitation as to what kind of spot.
Well, of course, it's been a pleasure.
Yes, it's been wonderful.
And just sit here.
What a wonderful setting. What a perfect setting.
Isn't it? It's a perfect setting for what you've written and researched. And I'm so glad to see you. And it just, you to me symbolize someone who has always had her wits about her. And, okay, well, we can, we can act on that.
That's me together.
Well, and you know what? Let me tell you something. There's no such thing as anyone being always together.
No, there isn't.
So it doesn't even matter.
Which is why I'm laughing, because yes, I mean, are there things, have I been able to put this together and be together enough to do this? I guess I should add that with the second book, the first thing I did was actually apply for county landmark status for the church and school. And so that book is based on the application that I wrote for cultural heritage site designation. Mm-hmm. And so then I expanded from that for the book. So it's that sort of thing. So yes, am I together enough to be able to do those sorts of things? But
of course,
there are lots of other things that we don't want to talk about.
No, of course not.
We're not.
No, but well, I thank you for that, because I have questions after the interview that I want to ask you about, because churches do change, they move, and what have you. And I want to ask you about all of that. But for right now, I just want to say thank you so much to all of our viewers here at Tolson's Chapel. Again, if you have any desire to contribute, please. TolsonsChapel.org. TolsonsChapel.org.
TolsonsChapel.org, because we cannot lose our history. And because the people here are working so you can't see it. They have a beautiful display here, historic display. They've done a lovely job at preserving the building. And it is important that we not let ourselves be erased from the landscape. we all know the kinds of things that are happening around us, and we have to fight for our history. It is really important for our children, for the generations to come. They need to know what we have contributed to our world, to the places we live, to this country.
Absolutely.
So
Couldn't have said that any better. Couldn't have said that any better at all. Or that's a whole thing. Well, I may have to have you back every time we do one, or replay just that little portion. I mean, it's wonderful. And thank you, Margo. Thank you for years of friendship, and thank you for being here today and for all the work that you've done.
I will say you can reach me.
Yes.
At MargoLeeWilliamsBooks.com.
There you go.
MargoLeeWilliamsBooks.com. All one word, MargoLeeWilliams Books.com.
And I think Williams must be a name that is shared. I want to know one day the history of the Williams. Where did the Williams people come from? I know you. Do you know?
I do know Williams is originally, well, it's considered a Welsh name.
I knew you were going to say Welsh.
It's a Welsh. Mm-hmm. It goes back and forth, but it's right up there with Smith and Jones and Brown. Mm-hmm. And so it is usually either the third or fourth most common name in the English-speaking world.
Sure it is.
So worldwide. But obviously, any group of Williamses, you have to talk about.
Of course, all the different ways that they came to be. But of course, she's a genealogist, so so many of the things.
It took me 40 years, but I finally found finally found my line. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay, well, there's Penny, there's so many. But anyway, well, we thank you. We thank you, and we hope you'll join us again, because we're going to have more authors on Right Talk. And, we want
write
you
that
here.
book.
And she wouldn't let that end without saying that last little thing, but I still love her. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good day, good week, and come see us.